All right, welcome to Data Hurls. My name is Michael Burke,
And I'm Chris Detzel.
and today we're going to talk about data.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about that, aren't you?
Absolutely.
All right, welcome everyone to our first podcast. My name is Chris Detzel, and
Michael Burke, nice to meet you.
we decided to start this podcast around kind of new technologies out there, or how people are using these new technologies and things like that. And we're actually doing this podcast now without a name, but we feel like eventually the name will come. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think that once we get a few of these going, Chris, like it'll just
Yeah,
come right out. We'll know what it is, we'll
yeah.
align against it, but for right now, we're nameless.
But there's this new technology out there, and I don't know how new it is. It's doing some research on it, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Called ChatGPT. I think you've heard of that, right, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is all the rage right now. I'm sure if every one of you has a LinkedIn account, you probably are getting dozens of posts on this from your friends or people claiming that their articles were not written by ChatGPT. So, um,
Yeah. Before we talk about ChatGPT, I want to get a little bit of background of who you are. Just so that the audience knows kind of your background and your story, and I'll give a little bit of mine after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in the data space now for about 7 years, especially in the data science space, leading data science teams, building culture around data, managing databases and infrastructure, and really excited today to be on this podcast and starting this with Chris. Um, I think that what we're going to do really is dive deep into technology and specific areas that we're interested in, ChatGPT being the first one since it's such a big news piece right now.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll get into some of the technicals, but really this is really going to be more of a high level conversation about application and really kind of like what the future of these applications could be with some of these technologies that are coming in.
Yeah, and your background is also machine learning and AI stuff, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
so I mean, you're
within the
kind of an
last,
expert there.
yeah, yeah, I would say I've done a lot now in the AI space. So.
So I'm Chris, and I've worked in kind of the space of community and working in technology for a long time. I've worked at a data company for a few years. I've worked at a cybersecurity company for a few years. I've worked at you know uh, Forrester Research for almost 9 years back, in the day, and worked with a lot of technologists and things like that. So I think that, for me, I kind of see myself as, a user of technology, or a person that can ask halfway decent questions, and done some podcasts in the past. But having a partner like Michael Burke that just is doing some fun things and seeing people do, some really cool things with these technologies is really exciting to me to really and to really dive in. So I'm excited. And so why don't we get started? Since we're going to talk a little bit about Chat GPT, I think most people know what that is, but if not, why don't you give us your definition of what you kind of, what have you seen? What is it? How are people using it? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I think the big thing, ChatGPT, at its highest level is a neural network that was trained on the internet, right? Um, and the reason that I think it's picked up so much traction lately is the accessibility and the user interface for how easy it is to get started, to sign up and start using it, right? And
Yeah.
essentially what it does is it has a very natural and intuitive feel to being able to ask a neural network questions and get fairly detailed responses that sound, very similar to what somebody might write in the real world, right? And Chris, I don't know if you got to play around with the tool
Oh,
at
I
all
did
yet,
a
but
lot, a lot. Yeah.
yeah, there's just so much that you can do, and the format in which you can ask questions is very variable. Like you can change what you want it to do, how you want it to respond, um, when and why you want it to respond, right? And it might make sense to later on just walk through a few examples of things
Yeah.
that we've tried out with this to kind of see kind of the application, start to think a little bit more about um, what a technology like this could be used for, um, if applied in the right ways, right? and also maybe some of the risks, right? What does a
Yeah.
technology like this bring with it as concerns and risks that are going to introduce problems as we step into this field, right?
Yeah, I have so many questions around that. I think that one is, as I've used it a little bit and played with it and got really excited about some of that stuff. I was doing some work stuff and doing this event, and I was like, my boss was like, "We need to get the essence of this event and what we call it." And I'm like, I'm not a essence kind of guy, and kind of not the kind of person that kind of can tie some of that stuff in there. And I tapped into Chat GPT. I said, what's a good theme around with these terms in it, with master data management, innovation, future forward looking thinking, all these things. And then it came up with like, you could do 10 if you want. I just said 5 themes and it came up with 5 themes. And I was like, it's a genius. You know what I mean? Like, this is really cool. It just kind of, it can write a bunch of content for you. And like you said, the look, the feel of it is kind of like it's talking to you. Did you ever see that show back in the day, and I'm dating myself, but it's called Knight Rider.
Oh
And
yeah.
basically, so basically, it was this car talking to you as it was a human, but it was a robot. In a sense, it knew everything and all things around the car or whatever. But it's kind of like that. But it scraped the internet and pretty much knows a lot of different things. From just from asking questions. It's pretty crazy. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not only, um, you know, one-to-one questions that you can ask it, right? Like saying, write me
Yep.
something about X, right? You can say, write me something about X in a casual form, or
Mm.
compare X and Y and describe it to me, right? And so when you think about, some of the use cases that we've been playing around with, for example, right? Um, I actually wrote something, and it was a little, write up that I was doing, and I said, you know what, this sounds way too formal. I tend to write pretty
Yeah.
formal. I'm like, rewrite this in a more casual tone, and it did it,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
it was trained off of the classification of what is, you know, formal versus casual writing styles, right? And it was able to make that distinction and give me back something that wasn't perfect. Obviously, it had issues, but it was definitely, when I read it, I was like, oh yeah, I can replace some of these words and do things like this to make what I'm writing sound more casual, right?
Yeah, a friend of mine or a colleague, we were talking about it the other day, and he said, I wrote a poem to my daughter, and I said, make a funny poem about, I don't know, whatever it was. And so it made it, and he kept kind of, he did the poem, and then he kept kind of, putting additional things in it, say, well,
Yeah,
make it sound, add this and make it sound blah. And then boom, he came up with this perfect poem for his daughter. And she loved it.
yeah,
Like, it was crazy. I was reading an article today on New York Times about Chat GPT, and they were talking about, how Microsoft, I guess, is investing in this company. The company's not Chat GPT, it's called open source something. I forget what
open
it's called.
AI. Yeah,
Open AI, yeah. And the way it started was, and I'm sure Michael, you can correct me a little bit, but from what I remember, the way it started was, they didn't really, this was technology from 2020, and they didn't want to push this out because they thought it would be boring and it's not new enough and everything else. But then when they put it out, literally millions of people in the first month, just got on it, and maybe it was more than that, but got on it and started using it. It's kind of a interesting uh uh it's an interesting way of how technology can just blow up, like social blows up a little bit, but this even blows up even more. And I think it's because, like you said, you sign up and then you're in, you can start using it right away.
yeah. And I think it was, they had, I was reading a similar article. I think it was like 5 million users in the first 5 days or something like that. It
Oh
was
yeah, 5 days.
beyond,
Yeah.
I'm probably getting that wrong because that seems too common, but you know, there the growth rate was faster than Netflix, it's
Yeah.
faster than Twitter. Like all these tech startups, these big tech
Yeah.
startups took way longer to
Over
accumulate
a
that many
year.
active
Over a
users.
year.
Yeah.
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 So
And so you just look at, you know, you start thinking about like what can this be applied to outside of of just like answering funny questions or writing poems, right? And not to say that that isn't pretty cool, because it definitely is,
Yeah.
right? Um, but when you start thinking about language, and not only language, but also
Mm.
image generation, right? Their DALL-E model, I don't know if you've seen that, Chris, but you can give it a description and it will create an image for you, right? And you start thinking about how these things working together can enhance your day-to-day life, right? And I was reading a really interesting article from a teacher recently who's inspiring his students to use it.
Mm.
And his thought process was, look, this type of technology is inevitable, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so I might as well have my students start embracing it and finding ways that they can leverage it to better what they're doing
Yeah.
than trying to prevent it and prevent them from using it to like cheat on their test or whatever. I think, and this is an area where I think it's really interesting, right? Like a
Mhm.
student who's learning to do something could really leverage from the descriptive analytics and information that a model like this can provide. On the other hand, if they're lazy, they can also plug in, write me a paper on X, Y, and Z, and it's going to be really hard for a teacher to
Yeah.
decipher if that's fraudulent or not, right? If they wrote it. And actually, the idea of fraud, now that we're on it, is like a whole nother space of, does a machine that was trained off of information really, are we copywriting, right? Is this
Yeah.
plagiarism to use this information that a machine is producing? And I think that as we kind of step into this new wave of using neural nets more and more for the general public, we're going to see a lot more of these challenges arise, right? Um,
Yeah, I think we'll adapt. I think you're right, but it's just like anything, this is different. This is way different than we've ever seen, and I've never seen anything like it. But but we adapt. We never saw anything like MySpace or then Facebook and all that other stuff back in the day, right? And internet. For me,
yeah,
internet was new. So all these things that are coming out, it's not surprising. It is spooky, but it's things that people have thought about for a long time, but finally can do it. You know what I mean? And you're starting to see it really happen, and it's pretty cool. Um, I kind of think about this as I even put in. So I build online communities. Like that's what I do at Reltio, and I've done that for a long time at other companies. And so I put in questions that people asked about Reltio, like technical questions, and it came up with the answer. I don't know if it was right, but I was like, wow, if that's right, then holy shit. What about, plugging that into like a product, like a very complex product like Reltio, for example? That's where we work. And let's say you plug it in somehow, some way, however they do it, and people just come in and ask questions and get your answer right there. Like, and it gives it to you within minutes. Support costs go down. Like a lot of things. People get answers quickly. They get what they need, and especially if it's the right answer, of course. I mean, think of that. Like, how do we use that as a company to plug it in? Now, they're going to be, oh my God, the risk. Somebody's going to get all this data and all this stuff, and so that's legit, right? And so, I think that we have to think about those risks. But I'm thinking of more of the holy cow. I can plug this into Reltio one day and just boom, get the answers perfectly,
yeah,
quickly.
yeah. I mean, and to your point about technical answers, what if that was embedded in a product, right? So we're
Exactly.
talking about master data management, right? Bringing sources together into one centralized golden record. There's a lot of complexities to that, creating rules, configurations,
Yeah.
right? Optimizing for scale. Some of these things require a lot of domain expertise. You need to know and understand the data in order to match it effectively. If you have a machine like this that can help advise,
Hmm.
how much time savings do you get, right? Um, and I just go back to things like when you think about like schooling, right, and learning and describing things, you know, sure, it's great to read a textbook and go through everything in a linear step by step. But what about that, kid who has a question that's going to take a long time to describe? Could they use something like
Yeah.
ChatGPT to learn about a new area of it's like an extension of what they're learning in school, right? I mean, I know this is always a challenge for a lot of us, right? Those who enjoyed school was like, hey, but what if we did this? What if I changed this? And all these thoughts that are going through your head, it's really hard to get a lot of answers back unless you have a lot of time with people who have that domain expertise. This is kind of an extension to be able to build and learn yourself, right, independently.
What do you think the market? So you and I are having a conversation about a week ago, and I don't know if you remember it, but basically you're telling me that like, this is just the beginning. When you look at ChatGPT, the billions of dollars that they've spent, like Microsoft has spent a lot of money, but now, Google is like, oh my God, we got to do the same stuff, and so I believe that somehow this is going to change the way technology companies like Google, Microsoft, et cetera, kind of go to market, use this kind of stuff within their products, and I don't know, maybe even sell it to some degree of some. But you told me, you go, Chris, this is just the beginning. We're gonna have, like you said, some big words about quantum computing. I don't know what you said, but basically it was some things around how much better and bigger this is gonna get. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I mean, even ChatGPT, right? We're on version 3. They're releasing 4. That's going to be, magnitude bigger and more in depth and be able to respond to a degree that's significantly better than what we have, right? And people are just wrapping their hands around, well, what can we do with this, right?
Yeah.
Another great example that's been talked about is like programming, right? You can
Yes.
ask ChatGPT to write a program for you, and it does a pretty good job, right? It might not be completely optimized to what a senior or principled engineer would be able to produce, but I've played around with this and asked it to write a few programs, and it does. If you know what kind of words and like keywords you need to make a really sound product or program, it'll do a good job at producing an output. And I think that the same thing can be used for debugging code, right? So when you think about like in the programming space, the application of like having a neural net review your code as a pull request, that's huge, right?
Yeah.
And
I
it
think
will find things that we just miss inherently because we're thinking about something else when we wrote that program, right?
just think attaching this to like some of your code. It sounds spooky, but like you just say, hey, automatically clean up all the bad code in here, or whatever. Maybe you teach it the right code, or maybe it learns the best practice of the code and starts doing it, itself. Or, for now, it's more about, hey, throw some code in there. What is the problem with this code? And then it tells you what the problem is for the code. Here's the right code. I've seen it. And I was like, Jesus. So
yeah,
pretty cool.
yeah. And it's not only a mechanism for like proofing, right? We have a lot of things, debuggers and other tools that will find errors, but it's also about like improvements, right? And I think one of the big things as a developer, especially one that's first starting out, is you learn the most simplest, easiest way to write code, right? And that can be something like a for loop, right? But
yeah,
as you get better, right, you learn new techniques that enable you to do things faster and more efficiently and more securely, right? And it will be interesting to see as things like ChatGPT evolve, will they be able to really advise on the right way to do something for a specific scenario? And I think that's where we kind of get into this next degree when we said, we're just getting started. Imagine ChatGPT as a specialist in a specific area. Like, how could that differentiate from this kind of generic machine that we've built today, right?
I
Think
just see
about
all
things
kinds of
like
opportunities. It's
experts.
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, experts advising or being advised by machines. I mean, I think that's really where we're going to be headed in the future, right? It's already possible to do that today with what we have. It's just not, there haven't been a lot of those applications built out yet.
I mean, little
But
things like Chrome extensions are already being built out to attach to like YouTube, for example,
yeah,
and then it spits out not just a transcript, but it just spits out 10. Like I tried it the other day, and it's like, just give me a view of what this is talking about, right? And it gives you like 5 to 10 points of what they're talking about on that YouTube. You know what I mean? Like, and transcripts, you can get transcripts directly from it. So before I would have to pay rev.com $100 for an hour long transcript. Now it's like, give me a transcript for this.
yeah,
Like, it's crazy, man.
yeah. Transcripts, translations.
Yeah.
There's so much. I think that, when we think about this too in the future, right? One of the biggest challenges that we with ChatGPT is that has the whole knowledge of the internet, which is amazing.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest challenges is it doesn't have the context of
Mm.
you and your situation, right?
It's not human, right? So
It's not human, but it also like it doesn't know and understand your scenario and why you're asking a specific
mm,
question. It doesn't know that, the person in school is an eighth grader trying to evolve from like, geometry to algebra or
mm.
whatever, algebra 2. Um, I think that when we start giving feedback into a model like this to help understand the context is where you're going to see a real differentiating change in how it responds to questions, right?
So quick
Um,
question on that. Like as
yeah,
I type something in there, is it learning as I'm kind of putting in there? Like if I say, it feels like it is because I can kind of get a little bit more depth. So what if I was, hey, I'm an eighth grader. I mean, which an eighth grader wouldn't do this, but I'm an eighth grader learning geometry, trying to figure out how to get to algebra. Can you help me with blah, 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 you know what I mean? Does it? It's
yeah,
like, oh, all of a sudden, and I mean, I see that it saves all your chats if you want, and you can go back in and start doing some more chats, around that same topic area. You know, is it learning
yeah.
as it goes? Like all these millions of users on there, is it just like, oh my God, it's learning so much, and then all of a sudden it just becomes, I don't know,
I mean, I think
So,
with any machine learning model, the ability to have a feedback loop from human interaction, which is what we're doing,
yeah,
is critical and it's baked into the process, right? Because to your point, you can also, and you probably haven't done this yet, but there's a little thumbs up and thumbs down to see if
I have seen it.
ChatGPT
Yeah,
gave you a good response or a bad response. All
yeah,
of that is a feedback loop for it to help correct itself as it's learning and training through this process, right? This continuous process of getting better. Now, to your point, I don't think that ChatGPT today is when you put in, I'm a software engineer in a query that it is classifying that and saying, okay, from here on out, I'm
uh,
gonna I'm gonna have responses that are, tailored to this type of person.
yeah.
But, you know, one of the areas where I think that companies like Google, for example, may have a severe advantage in building out models like this in the future is that they have a lot more of that information already about the general
Mm,
population, right?
yeah,
And that's how they're able to distribute and target ads so well, right?
yeah.
But what if they could use that same kind of background or persona that they've built and use that to help tailor a model like their own version of ChatGPT, right? That's where I think we get into this really interesting space of creating models that have more relatability and more context to what they know about you.
What does it take when you think of, and these are just interesting to me. So, if they're not, then we can stop. But basically, what does it take to run something like this, to go and scrape the internet for all this information? And, what does it look in the background? How are they, to us, it's like, oh my God, look at this really cool thing. I mean, but what is it? What's powering this thing?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea of just collecting information, right, at the very highest level is it seems like it's complete chaos. But there's also all of these strategies that are taken underneath the hood. And I'm not an expert in ChatGPT, so I don't
Yeah.
know all of the details, but there's this whole thing called blocking, right? And chunking of information. So how do you categorize it in ways that is meaningful so that a model can learn about it in specific ways, right? And when you think about the internet, you're like, well, how the heck does that work at
Yeah.
scale, right? And that's a whole field of research on being able to sort and chunk and organize information in a way that it can be fed into a neural network or any machine in a way that's more meaningful, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I think that there's a lot more there, right? And this is kind of some of the similar spaces that we're playing in right now in the MDM space, right? It's like how can you generalize something enough so that you can cut it up into little pieces where, if you were looking at the whole internet, right? Or even like 1,000 or 10,000 different records of data.
Yeah.
If you had to compare one record to every other record, it would be a massive computational nightmare, right?
Mhm.
And so this idea of chunking and blocking and organization really says that you can say, okay, well, this piece of information needs to be compared to these 5 other things in this block.
Mm.
And so it makes it a much easier problem where it may not be a perfect answer because it hasn't looked at every other response in this set of data, right? But it's much more computationally feasible.
It's
Now,
crazy.
I think there are some problems that when we talk about neural networks where you unlock a whole nother realm of computational resources that we should probably do a whole nother podcast on because I think it's really interesting. But you know, I think that when we talk about like these blocking and chunking strategies in the future, um, there's a lot more that we can do with how we process and synthesize data with quantum computing and neural networks.
Are there ethical and privacy concerns that exist with something like this, models like ChatGPT, and you know, how are they addressing the issues if there are? Do you know?
So as far as I can tell, all they have is kind of a disclaimer saying, don't use this for commercial use cases. And
Yeah,
if you're looking for, the rights to something, you need to go talk to the original authors. But
they don't
I
give
don't
you
know
that.
if I don't know if you get that. Yeah, I haven't seen it, right? But the ability to source, when we think about, we all learned how to write sources for reports and
Yeah.
everything like that growing up, all these different formats and functions.
Hmm.
How do you source a
Yeah.
model that might have been trained on 15,000 papers about the same information to give you a response that it gave, right? That's going to be, I think, one of the things that's really will evolve out of this is how do we give credit back to the people that are actually feeding the knowledge for a machine like this to generalize, or should we? Right? In my opinion, we should. We need to have
Yeah.
traceability and accountability in a model like this. Is it feasible? I don't know. Um, and I think it becomes even more complicated with images, right? When you're learning about images and like what does a cat or dog look like, right? And if I write show me an image of a cat and it draws this image of a cat, even if it's learned against looking at other images that were classified for that specific animal, you know, is that copywritten or not, right? Who
Yeah.
owns the rights to that? There's a lot of complexities there that I don't know that we've been able to sort out. It's going to require a lot more thinking and planning as we dig into it. But again, like everything on the internet, we release it first and we deal with the consequences later.
Yeah. I mean, you have Google and others dealing with consequences several years later
Yeah.
now, right? Like, I mean, like 20 years later after all this stuff, but and with social and things like that, it's quite interesting, and it will evolve. And something like this could just, I don't think it's going to, but it could just take off like it has, and then just kind of burn. Depends,
Yeah.
right? Like, if the government gets involved or whatever, and that's possible, right? Like they'll be like, oh my God, stop this now because China's getting, you know what I mean? Like it could just turn into a nightmare if they don't figure out security and things like that. Because I believe, like, what if I'm chatting there and then it can see things on, I don't know, like I just normal human kind of thinking, but people still use it. They don't really care. So it'd be interesting for sure.
I think that, yeah, one of the biggest concerns that keep me up at night too is, and again, not to be the conspiracy theorist or anything, right? But a model like this, if we become dependent on it, you think about like
Mhm.
Google, it started off as this fun little search engine, and now you
Yeah,
don't do anything but Google, right?
that's right.
I think the same thing could happen with an emerging neural network like this, where we all just become dependent on it. And the same concerns come up. Like when you're creating information that's going to be educating a large population, who's auditing that, right? What are the consequences? What are the
Mm,
opportunities to be able to change that information? And what effect would that
mm,
have on the general population, right? I think those types of questions are ones that we're still working through from the previous generation of search engines and social media and whatnot and advertisements, right? But even more so when we talk about using this as a learning mechanism, right? It becomes even scarier, right? Because what is real, right? If
mm.
this machine turns back a recollection of history that's different than what you'd read in a textbook, who's auditing that? I don't think anyone is right now, right?
Hopefully
So I
the
think,
textbook is published on the
yeah,
internet somewhere.
yeah, and this is kind of the same grounds of like Wikipedia, right? Anybody can change and update it,
Oh yeah.
but yet a lot of people use it as a source of learning, right? And a source of fact, like they consider what's on there as factual. So I think that
That's
there's
true.
again like a ton here, and you could say that we've been doing this for years, right? Even with books that we publish and
Yeah.
historical papers and whatnot. But at least in those contexts, you were able to identify that there was a source, there was an expert that you trusted. Now the source is ambiguous, right? So that gives a
It's
lot more
from a bunch of different
opportunity.
people,
Right. It's from a
from
bunch of
different
different
places.
people. It's like, that uncle that says, take my word for it, right? You
Yeah.
run into this whole other space that it is ambiguous and it's a little scary. So there's a lot of kind of checks and balances that I think will need to be set on, well, what information is being trained to give you that response? And how can I look back and see those sources, right? In some way or another.
When you look at kind of back probably 5 months ago when Web3 was kind of the thing, right? And I still believe there's something there for Web3, but is this part of that?
I mean, I think that neural networks, they've been around now for a while. And
Yeah,
I
but
think that it's, sorry, go ahead.
next generation, as you kind of think about Web3 and all the promises that bring, this obviously I think could be part of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Web3 has a lot of kind of open promises, right? But
Mm.
ChatGPT could certainly be a piece of that, right? And um, if you think about, like, again, we've talked about some of the applications, but like how this could better even more complicated problems if it was applied right, in this space. Like if you even think about a search engine, right? You know, how should Chat GPT respond the same depending on where you are in a location? Should it respond the same depending on what language you're writing in? Um, I think that there's a lot more that we can dive into the context again of what is the right response for the right person at the right place and time. Yeah.
This has been great. Did I miss anything? Should I ask the question that was burning that you wanted to answer?
I guess my question is really like, you've kind of just, I've known about OpenAI for now over a year.
Yeah.
Um, I've been playing around with it for a long time. And so I'm thrilled that it's getting traction because I think that this is the kind of conversations that we need to start having. But
Yeah.
in your opinion, as somebody who's, fairly new to this, what have you been using it for? You gave one example, but what else have you been trying out? Um,
Yeah. I would say like I would put in a transcript, but like here's how I did. Like you can't throw an entire transcript in there of it only will take a certain number of words. A lot of it, but not all of it, right? But so I throw like I was for work, I was doing a show, and so I wanted to get a transcript, not a transcript, but a kind of a quick analysis of what did they say in the thing, so I can push it out onto like not a blog, but hey, here's the show, here's what is it about, within 3-4 bullets. Then
yeah,
push it out. I had to go correct some words and kind of clean it up a little, but it will give you kind of a quick hit if you ask it to. I mean, I was looking at themes and for work stuff. It's like, oh my God, this is awesome. I own a website, and it's a running website that, I need more content on, and I would throw out, hey, or I can throw out more content there, but also what I did was I went to optimize my website. So for example, I had all this content on there, but I'm not the best writer. I'm not a terrible writer, but I was like, please optimize this for the best SEO, and then uh throw in my content there. And then it would give me this better, cleaner version of what I just said, right? And then I pushed that out onto the website, so it did that, and even titles, like what would you call, like I said something about, DFW running group, find your groups here, or find places to meet other people or whatever. And I was like, what else can you say about that? And it gives me like 5, 10 new titles, and I'm like, ooh, that's a good one. I'd use that one. You know what I mean? Like, so
Yeah.
from a content standpoint, it's numerous. I mean, you could get it to write you an entire blog if you wanted, and say, hey, is there additional things? I mean, but you got to see if it's right. You got to clean it up. I like to do it like, for me, the way I kind of use it is I already have the content, but I want it to spit out what I just said, because I don't like, if I wanted to write a blog about, how to build an online community, for example, and then kind of put in some parameters and things like that, I could do that as well. You know what I mean? Like, so there's a lot of things that it can do, and I get excited because then I think I told you, it's like, on our community, there's unanswered questions on there, and I thought, well, can I answer this technical question? I put it in there, and I'm not going to post it yet, but I'm going to ask the expert to say, hey, yeah, this is right or wrong.
Yeah.
And, so if it's right, I was like, oh my God. You know what I mean? Like, I couldn't believe it, like, it's just kind of crazy. So that's some of the things I've been using it for. And it just, I have so many things that I like you're saying, the golden kind of ticket for like an online community, for a support community, kind of like ours, is pushing pushing the community inside the product so people can ask questions and get answers quickly. What if we could do this with something like a ChatGPT, to where it can go into your documentation and just understand it all, go to your community and wherever Reltio is, and even kind of read everything about, all things Reltio, whatever it is, and then boom, you put in a question, get the answer, and or maybe it's bad code here. Here's the code that you should use and things like that. I mean, geez, dude, this is game changing in a lot of ways. Yeah, I can see how people cheat and stuff, but you know what? I mean, we'll have to adapt, and it's not good that they can do that, but what is good is we always adapt and we figure it out. And maybe, some people think, hey, we're just getting dumber as time moves on. As a matter of fact, I don't think so. But anyways, I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, you're right. I mean, there's pros and cons to all of this, right? And I think that, again, like, it's almost too much to be able to figure out until we start to see the impact, right? We kind of
Yeah.
have to measure this carefully. But I do think that the auditability of a model like this at the end of the day is just so critical, right? Because it should be, like anything else, being able to trace back to actual sources. And if we don't have that, it just leaves companies that make these models open to their discretion, right? And I think that's a huge risk. So whether or not we use those sources or how we enforce kind of ruling around things like this, that's totally different. But at least having the ability to audit, provides that one fundamental foothold that can get us back to what was actually written and created, right? And I think that traceability and transparency is what we'll kind of step into when we see these new types of models emerge. I think that we have to have something like that in the long run.
I don't disagree. Michael, it's been good, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll see you on the next one. This is exciting.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I'm Chris Detzel and
Michael Burke. Thank you.
All right. Take care.